Welcome to Music History Monday for June 17th, 2024. I'm Bob Greenberg, and the title for today's podcast is Unsung Heroes. If you haven't already, please consider joining me on my subscription site at patreon.com/RobertGreenbergMusic, where I blog, vlog, podcast, pontificate, review, and bloviate 4 to 6 times a week. We mark the death on June 17th, 2014, and even 10 years ago today, of the Grammy Award-winning American record producer and director of Columbia Masterworks recordings, John Taylor McClure. McClure was born in Rahway, New Jersey on June 28, 1929, and died in Belmont, Vermont at the age of 84, 11 days short of his 85th birthday. Record producers. The title of this post says it all. Unsung Heroes. It is my experience that unless someone has personally been involved in creating a recording, it's pretty much impossible to appreciate the amount of work a producer puts into the process and the degree to which the producer's own musical taste, musical proclivities, and musicality influence the final product. The front of a record jacket or CD case might bear the image of a composer or performer, and the producer's name might appear in the tiniest of print on the lower left-hand corner of the back of the jacket. But, in fact, in terms of their singular impact on a recording, the producer should, by all rights, be pictured on the front of the album side by side with whomever else the producer deems worthy of joining them. Over the years, I've featured a few of the most important record producers of the post-World War II era. Thus far, I've written about the opera record producer John Rhodes Coleshaw, 1924 to 1980, Dr. Bob Prescribes, March 24, 2020, the Beatles record producer and so-called fifth Beatle, George Martin, 1926 to 2016, Music History Monday, January 3rd, 2022, and Dr. Bob Prescribes, January 4th, 2022, and the jazz record producer Orrin Keepnews, 1923 to 2015, Music History Monday, March 21st, 2021. Today, we add John McClure to this august list. The job of a record producer. Here's how the Recording Academy, formerly known as the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, or NARAS, defines a record producer. Quote, the person who has overall creative and technical control of the entire recording project and the individual recording sessions that are part of that project. He or she is present in the recording studio or at the location recording and works directly with the artist and engineer. The producer makes creative and aesthetic decisions that realize both the artist's and label's goals in the creation of musical content. Other duties include, but are not limited to, keeping budgets and schedules, adhering to deadlines, hiring musicians, singers, studios, and engineers, overseeing other staffing needs, and editing, unquote. And editing, oh yes. I trust we all realize that expert editing will make and bad editing break almost every musical and literary enterprise. from book editors and newspaper editors, to television and film editors, to radio producers and record producers. It is the editors/producers that are, in the end, responsible for shaping and delivering the final product that goes out to the public. When it comes to making a recording, then, the producer is the chief, the chef, the yefe, the top dog, the geeter with the heater, the big boss with the hot sauce, that single person responsible for every aspect of a recording, from hiring the players to running the recording sessions to supervising the editing to choosing the cover art. Having said all of that, we should also be aware that the exact job of a record producer will vary depending upon the genre of music involved, meaning operas or concert music or rock, pop, country, hip-hop, or jazz, and whether the recording is made in a studio or live in front of an audience. A concert music record producer, like today's featured producer, John McClure, is working from a script, a composer's score. Whether a producer is partnered up with a conductor and an orchestra, or a string quartet, or a solo pianist, or whatever, said producer's job is to present that conductor's, that quartet's, or that pianist's interpretation of the score in as flattering a sonic environment as possible. In a studio, such a recording will typically be done in multiple takes. In the case of a live performance, multiple performances will typically contribute bits and pieces to the final edited recorded product. A producer of opera recordings is also dealing with the script, again with a composer's score. But they must also cope with a vastly greater number of moving parts than a concert music record producer. Not just instrumentalists, but solo singers as well, and not unusually, choruses as well. But even more than all of the moving parts, an opera recording producer must deal with the egos of the singers, meaning that such a producer must have the calm, steady nerves of a brain surgeon and the diplomatic skills of Kofi Annan. The English-born John Royds Coleshaw was just such an opera recording producer. In 1956, at the age of 32, he was appointed manager of Decca Records' classical recording division, one of the most important and influential positions in not just the record industry, but in the entire world of concert music and opera. At a time when opera recordings were typically made during live performances, Coleshaw was a visionary, someone who believed that the only way to create what he called, quote, a theater of the mind, unquote, was to make studio opera recordings in which no detail was spared in an attempt to conjure up an opera's action in the mind of the listener. At the time Coleshaw decided to personally produce operas, Decca already had the world's greatest team of recording engineers. To his team, Coleshaw added the Hungarian-born conductor Georg Solti, 1912 to 1997, whose muscular, energized performances were, in the 1950s, putting the opera world on its ear. From there, Coleshaw went out and hired the best singers Decca's money could buy. Coleshaw produced a lot of great recordings, but none more important than Richard Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung. Recorded in studio between 1958 and 1965, with the Vienna Philharmonic conducted by Georg Solti and featuring many of the greatest singers of the mid-20th century, this epic recording was the subject of Dr. Bob Prescribes on March 24, 2020. In poll after poll, including ones held by Gramophone magazine and the BBC, John Colshaw's Ring has been voted by the listening public to be, quote, the greatest recording of all time, unquote. It's an appraisal with which the critics agree. In 1915, Paul Robinson, writing in the Journal of the Music Critics Association of North America, called the Colshaw Ring, quote, the benchmark recording by which all others are judged, unquote. Rock and roll, pop, hip-hop, country, and so forth recordings are typically made in a very different manner than concert music and opera recordings. Far from working from a pre-existing script, meaning a composer's score, much and sometimes even most of the music and its arrangement are created during the actual process of a studio recording. Yeah, for our information, unless a pop or rock or hip-hop recording is documenting a particular concert, for example, Woodstock or Live Aid or so forth, live recordings are the exception, not the rule. More than anyone else, it was the English record producer, arranger, conductor, composer, audio engineer, and musician, Sir George Martin, who made recording rock and roll a studio art. He produced 13 albums and 22 singles for the Beatles between 1962 and 1970. All told, it's a body of work that adds up to less than 10 hours of music. But here's a case where numbers do not tell the story, because thanks to George Martin, those 9 hours plus of recorded music revolutionized the world of popular music. Martin was not just a master musician, but a master technologist, someone not just versed in modern musical technology, but with a genius towards how to use it. From the use of multi-track recording and overdubbing, to running tapes backwards and his employ of synthesizers, to using traditional instruments in untraditional ways, George Martin was able to create a Beatles sound in the studio that increased the sonic vocabulary of popular music 100-fold, well, maybe 1,000-fold, perhaps a gazillion-fold, whatever, a lot of folds. Martin described himself as, quote, a realizer of their ideas, so that if John wanted something really weird, I had to try and provide it for him. Or if Paul wanted some extraordinary orchestration, I had to try and find out what he wanted, unquote. The job of a jazz record producer is, again, a completely different kettle of notes. Jazz is an improvisatory and conversational art form. The spontaneity of jazz guarantees that no two jazz performances will be exactly the same, and that therefore no one jazz performance can be considered definitive. Except in the rarest of rare occasions, multiple takes will not be edited together to create a single jazz performance. On those same lines, except in the rarest of rare occasions, jazz producers will not layer in sounds and or sound effects that could not be achieved in a live performance. Rather, 99% of the time, plus or minus, the job of a jazz record producer is to create the ambiance and sensibility of a live performance. The jazz producer Orrin Keepnews put it this way, quote, our, meaning the jazz producer's, job is to create what is best described as realism, the impression and effect of being real, unquote. Keepnews insisted that his job as a jazz producer was not to shape the musical end result, but rather to act as a facilitator, as a catalyst, as someone who lets the music happen by allowing the musicians to be confident, relaxed, and to play at their best. This is why so many jazz albums, those made by Keepnews as well, are recorded live. What sonic control is lost by working outside the confines of a studio is made up by spontaneity and audience-induced energy. John Taylor McClure, 1929 to 2014. John McClure would have been the first person to tell you that he wasn't much of a musician. He played piano by ear when he was a kid, but admitted that he always struggled when he, quote, got to the hard part, unquote. I know all about that. His only formal training as a pianist, really as a musician, occurred when he took piano lessons as a student at Oberlin College in the late 1940s. But those lessons came to an end when he dropped out. From there, McClure headed to New York City, where he attended New York University and the New School for Social Research, today simply the New School, though once again, he failed to graduate from either institution. Clearly having a hard time finding himself, McClure kicked around New York City for the next couple of years. He took on a string of jobs, including a brief stint in the Merchant Marine and a gig installing high-fidelity systems in private homes. In 1950, at the age of 21 and lacking any technical training beyond installing hi-fi equipment, he took an entry-level job at the Carnegie Hall Recording Company. And just like that, McClure's slacker days were over. Within a few years, he was operating a recording console at Columbia Records. And by the late 1950s, at exactly the time stereo recording was becoming the big new thing, he was promoted to producer. John McClure never quite got over the fact that someone with no real musical or technical training, meaning himself, was producing records for some of the world's very greatest and most accomplished musicians. He would disarm friends, colleagues, musicians, and potential critics alike with such self-effacing comments as, quote, "The imposter continues undiscovered," unquote. But in fact, John McClure was one of the great record producers of the 20th century. Musically, he knew what he wanted, and he insisted on getting it. For example, he made over 30 recordings with Igor Stravinsky. In 1965, with the elderly and frail Stravinsky conducting one of his own works in a recording session, McClure firmly insisted on a number of retakes, even after Stravinsky himself claimed to be satisfied. Interpersonally, McClure had what I called earlier, quote, the nerves of a brain surgeon and the diplomatic skills of Kofi Annan. The great film composer John Williams, born 1932, who as conductor of the Boston Pops Orchestra frequently recorded with McClure in the 1980s and early 1990s, said in an interview that McClure had that special ability to manage, quote, delicate musical personalities and the tension they could stir, unquote. Williams further observed, quote, he was able to diffuse things by finding humor or by causing everyone to see something larger than the moment. Sometimes that was the music, unquote. John McClure produced and recorded a wide variety of musical genres. He made recordings with the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. In the jazz world, he produced, among others, Dave Brubeck and Joe Williams. He recorded such folk groups as Peter, Paul, and Mary, and he engineered the string parts for Pink Floyd's 1979 concept album, The Wall. Nevertheless, McClure's great fame rests on his recordings of the concert repertoire. 3 of his albums won Grammy Awards for Classical Album of the Year. Stravinsky Conducts The Rite of Spring and Petrushka, which won in 1962. Bernstein Symphony No. 3, Kaddish, which won in 1965. And Mahler Symphony No. 8, Symphony of a Thousand, conducted by Bernstein, which won in 1968. McClure won a 4th Grammy in 1986 in the category of Best Cast Show Album for his recording of Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, which was conducted by Bernstein and featured Kiri Te Kanawa as Maria and Jose Carreras as Tony. As a testament to how seriously he took the awards, John McClure kept his Grammy statuettes in a cardboard box stored in his barn in Vermont. McClure produced his greatest number of recordings, around 200, with Leonard Bernstein. The first, Dmitri Shostakovich's Symphony No. 5, was recorded in 1959, just after Bernstein's return from Russia after touring there with the New York Philharmonic. In 1988, McClure wrote this about working with Bernstein, quote, "The man is not long on patience and not stingy with blame. Nevertheless, I kept coming back for more because Bernstein was unfailingly stimulating, educational, maddening, and musically nutritious," unquote. Perhaps most nutritious were Bernstein's groundbreaking recordings of the symphonies of Gustav Mahler, a body of work that Bernstein almost single-handedly resurrected in the 1950s and 1960s. These recordings were produced by John McClure, and their warm and detailed sound, which contributed mightily to their popularity, must be credited to McClure. In closing, allow me to drive the point home. Let us never, ever fail to properly credit the producer for a recording. Their name might appear only in small print, but their contribution to making a recording is fully as great as the performers themselves, whose names are writ large and whose images are plastered all over the front of a record jacket. Thank you. To sample and download one or all of my many courses on subjects musical produced by the Great Courses/The Teaching Company, please visit my website at robertgreenbergmusic.com.